Welcome to MEP's special series on online harassment as a form of gender-based violence in commemoration of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. We're delighted to have Sukaina Al-Nasrawi, Social Affairs Officer and lead of Smart, Safe, and Resilient Cities program at ESCWA in Beirut, Lebanon, with us today to talk about online harassment as a form of gender-based violence. Thank you so much, Sukaina, for your time today. I'd like to start with just a general picture of how you think gender-based violence is perceived in the MENA region.
Thank you, Merissa. Thank you for the team, and thank you for Wilson Center for hosting me. In terms of, it's a great pleasure, actually. In terms of gender-based violence, it is perceived relatively differently in the region. However, in ESCWA, which is the Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, we use the definition that is present in international law and all UN frameworks. It's the definition, of course, proposed by the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, which is echoed in the Beijing Platform for Action and clarified in the various general recommendations of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. It is also reiterated in the communications of the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, and it refers to the harmful acts directed at individuals based on their gender, and it is rooted in gender inequality, the abuse of power, and harmful norms. So this is the way we regard gender-based violence, and this is the way that is relatively regarded in the region. Now, unfortunately, there are different forms of gender-based violence that occur throughout the Arab region, just as they do globally. And statistics indicate that prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, 37% of all partnered women in the region experienced physical and or sexual intimate partner violence in their lifetime. And some indicators even imply that this percentage might have been even higher. Now, there are, of course, other forms of violence that persist. For example, in the Arab region, I mean, 1 in 5 girls in the Arab region marry under the age of 18, and we all know this is one form of violence. And the region accounts for 1/4 of all female genital mutilation cases worldwide. In addition, rates of domestic and gender-based violence in the region are alarmingly underreported. The COVID-19 crisis, if you're interested to know, has even compounded vulnerabilities in the Arab region, and violence and gender-based violence has increased in severity and in scale.
Yeah, and that we've seen that worldwide as well since the COVID-19 pandemic. But thank you for sharing.
If you also allow me, Merissa, since the Arab region is relatively a region that is specific in terms of context, it is important to note that any discussion about gender-based violence in the Arab region must take a nuanced approach, accounting for the specificities of the context. Like, each country is different. There are countries in the Arab region that are affected by conflict, others that are under occupation, others that are classified as least developed countries, others are oil-rich countries, and the types of violence and the causes, they vary from one country to another. So just to say that a blanket statement about violence in the region must account for these specificities.
Yeah, absolutely. And that gets me actually to the next question about another form of gender-based violence, which we are focused on for this series, and that's online harassment. I think that is gender-based. We've interviewed a number of researchers and a Syrian journalist who spoke to us about how prevalent this phenomenon is online. Is there awareness in the region that this is actually a form of GBV?
Well, yes, I would say there is an increasing awareness in the Arab region on the importance of online harassment and on the importance of combating online violence, of course, online harassment included, and considering it as a form of GBV. Now, as we all know, in 2015, countries around the world, and all Arab countries included, adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which recognized the impact of gender-based violence on the human well-being through its various sustainable development goals. And when we say gender-based violence, of course, we are looking into offline and online violence. And specifically, this was addressed through Goal 5. So yes, there is increasing awareness and there is increasing emphasis within the UN system on the importance of combating online violence. Like I would mention in here, in 2018, for instance, the UN Special Rapporteur, I mean, we all know that there is a UN Special Rapporteur on violence against women, but like in 2018, the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women further extended the concept of the intersections of violence and highlighted online violence, and of course, online harassment included. So online violence and its different forms from a human rights perspective, and noted the worsening of violence against women and girls in full or in part because of the use of information and communication technologies, like such as phones, internet, social media platforms, email, and other means. So there's an increased awareness in that regard.
So I wonder, there is increased awareness, but do you think as there is more awareness that on online harassment, does that discourage girls and women from actually going online? I mean, we're, in a world that's connected online like no other time, particularly now that work has shifted completely online with the COVID-19 pandemic. So how do these different sort of factors play out?
Well, absolutely. I mean, technology, I just mentioned the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and technology in Goal 5, which focuses on gender equality, was mentioned as a mean to achieve gender equality. So technology has become a double-edged sword. So it can help us. It can help us achieve gender equality if properly used, but if not adequately used, it can lead to perpetrating additional and new forms of violence, which, to answer your question, which definitely makes women and girls more apprehensive in the digital space. Now, research shows that more than 70% of women and girls online are exposed to forms of violence. Of course, most of them, they remain unreported, and this increases the reluctance, I would say, of women and girls to step into that digital space. However, during the pandemic, I would say despite the existing digital gender divide, which is at its highest in the Arab region, women and girls started using the internet more frequently during the global pandemic. I mean, they had to. So women, men, girls, and boys turned to the internet for work, school, and social activities. This increase was tightly coupled with an increase in online violence, of course, in different forms, in forms of physical threats, sexual harassment, stalking, bombing, and trolling, and particularly for users with limited digital skills. And in our case, in this case, it's women and girls.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, during the pandemic, like in the Arab region, online harassment was the highest reported type of violence against women during the pandemic. And in 2020, actually 24% of individuals in the Arab region reported either witnessing or knowing a woman who was subjected to online violence. So therefore, since the pandemic and the lockdowns, awareness of online harassment as a form of a GBV has further increased in the Arab region, but also at the same time, rates increased. And here comes the importance of always advancing the digital literacy of women and girls on how to use those digital technology and their presence online and protect their safety.
And that has to be a priority. Education is digital education and digital literacy in particular. But beyond that and beyond raising awareness, we also need to have strong legislation in order to address that. So are there such laws in the region that focus on anti-harassment online, particularly, that is activity that's gender-based. Of course, all online harassment is bad. And are there any examples where legal action actually did take place to basically, seek justice?
Okay, the straight answer is yes and no, and I'll go into the details of that. Actually, I just mentioned international human rights framework on gender-based violence and violence against women and girls recognize that technology is not only used to perpetrate violence, but it's also a key tool for combating different forms. Now, Arab countries have committed to these frameworks in some way, but as your question, basically, legislative and policy reforms addressing violence against women in both physical and virtual spaces are needed. And I would like to underline the physical and virtual spaces, because there is a false dichotomy between offline and online violence that underestimates the harms of cyber violence against women and girls, right, and basically characterizes victims' experiences as incidents rather than repeated behavioral patterns.
Right.
Okay. So, and even research indicates that the perpetrator of offline violence against women and girls often repeats the acts online with the same victims. Mm-hmm. So there is this mutually reinforcing relationship between combating offline and online violence against women. And I'm saying so to basically drive you to the issue of the existence of laws, because sometimes the existence of laws combating violence against women, like physical violence against women, addresses technology matters, and in some other times it doesn't. Mm-hmm. So they don't. So we've undertaken at ESCWA, in collaboration with different UN entities, UN Women, UNFPA, and UNDP back in 2019, a study that overviewed the status of laws in terms of laws and gender justice, gender combating violence, of course, included. It covered 18 countries out of 22 countries in the Arab region, and it showed that 33% of countries have domestic violence laws and 50% have sexual harassment law. But a thorough analysis of these laws indicate that technology is not considered, right, except for very few cases. And I'm gonna give you some details about them. Mm-hmm. Like in the case of Egypt and Morocco, they've amended their laws to criminalize the use of electronic devices and social media for sexual harassment. Mm-hmm. In the case of Saudi Arabia, they criminalized sexual harassment in 2018, including cyberbullying. Mm-hmm. In Lebanon and Jordan, they've respectively launched cybercrime units where women can report online harassment directly to the police. Mm-hmm. And in Morocco and Tunisia also, they've took some measures. In Morocco, basically Morocco's law on violence against women penalizes sexual harassment on social networks. Mm-hmm. and addresses online violence, whereas in Tunisia, there is a capitalization on the violence against women law to issue a retaining order for a survivor of cyber harassment that turned into physical harassment.
Oh, wow.
So there are good practices. They're not common to the whole region, but there are good practices in the region. Yeah, so if we were to investigate in the status of cybercrime laws in the Arab region, mm-hmm. we note also that it varies between countries.
Right.
Currently, only 60% of Arab countries have enacted laws to combat cyber violence, cybercrime, apologies. And when I say cybercrime, this online violence and harassment is included. So the very first country in the Arab region to have adopted such a law was the United Arab Emirates back in 2006. So it was the first country in the region to adopt such a law. It was followed in 2007 by Saudi Arabia, which issued a cybercrime law named the Information Technology Crime System. Mm-hmm. And then 11 other countries from the Arab region followed. These are Sudan, Algeria, Jordan, Oman, Syria, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, Mauritania, Egypt, and Palestine. So all in all, 13 out of 22 Arab countries already enacted cyber crime laws, but unfortunately, no Arab states so far signed the Budapest Convention, which is the Council of Europe Convention on Cybercrime.
I mean, it's good to know that there are laws in the region that criminalize cyber crimes, but also basically address the anti-harassment and online violence, specifically targeting women. But of course, we need to see these laws being implemented. And that gets me to the next question, which is how can women's groups work with governments, civil society, but particularly the private sector? And I'm really going to zoom into the tech industry here. What is their role to also, they have to be part of the solution because they're providing this technology.
Of course, I mean, combating gender-based violence and online harassment is, apologies, is something that cannot be addressed by one stakeholder. All relevant stakeholders have to have a say in this. Now, one of the main entry points to combating what I call the pandemic of offline and online harassment is through top-down changes introduced by governments and political leaders enacting the appropriate legislative and policy reforms. Now, the state government has the obligation of due diligence. And in this context, it is the obligation of the state to prevent, protect against, prosecute, punish, and provide damages for GBV perpetrated by state and non-state actors. And of course, this is, we all know, this is enshrined in international human rights laws. Governments play a central role in combating cybercrime by ratifying, as I just mentioned, the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, and basically enacting laws to protect women and girls from all types of online violence. And by strengthening specialized protocols and codes of conduct for law enforcement, governments play a critical role in breaking the cycle of online violence. They play a role in informing internet users about these protocols, where to report cases of online violence, and in times of pandemics such as COVID that we've went through, inform users how to access essential service online. However, it's not only limited to governments, as you just said. Civil society plays a role, the private sector plays a role, individuals themselves play a role. So, while the state, as I said, while the state is ultimately responsible, good practice shows that the state must work with and support women's organization and civil society, particularly when rendering services that are holistic and survivor-centered, okay? And it is always recommended that women's civil society provide the direct services. I mean, these are from our research in the region. Now, civil society organizations, and I'll reach to the private sector, but I thought, like, we talked about governments, and the civil society organization also play a central role in combating gender-based violence, because they can raise awareness and help advocates, educators, and internet users to identify and report online violence, online harassment included, surely. They can also provide tools and resources needed for women and girls to report online violence and produce simple communication materials that demonstrate its harmful impact, especially on high-risk groups of women and girls. Now, partnering with the private sector would also indicate an effort at a holistic approach. When I talk about private sector, I actually would like to focus on what we call internet intermediaries. Okay, because they play an important role in combating violence and harassment included. They can set clear commitments, and this is based on how and what they can do. Internet intermediaries, they can set clear commitments to safeguard women and girls in online spaces and provide accessible and transparent reporting procedures for online violence. And among many, many actions, internet intermediaries should invest in education campaigns. They have the resources, and they're the producers of the technologies, and
the reach,
the providers of the services. So exactly, and they have the, I mean, their outreach is really big. So they should invest in education campaigns on preventing online gender-based violence and promoting human rights and digital security for all.
And is this happening, Sukaina?
It is happening in a limited way, I would say. There are like big tech companies that are undertaking those education campaigns and basically encouraging women and girls to be present online, and at the same time educating them on how to be safely present online. However, more efforts need to be exerted, and more efforts should cover the whole of the Arab region.
And what does it take to get more internet intermediaries to be part of that effort?
Well, it takes highlighting the return on investment, because we're talking about the private sector, so they're interested in investment. So it takes basically shedding light on what they are losing when it comes to not having women and girls connected. It takes to show what we are losing when we are not educating them on how to be safely present, and how by not educating women and girls and how to be safely present, we are losing their presence online, and therefore the private companies are losing. And this takes me actually to another logic that we follow to combat violence against women and to try to foster change, and that is by costing violence, the economic cost of violence against women, and show governments and decision makers how much violence against women is costing the country if it's not combated. So it basically follows the same logic.
Absolutely. Well, you've described all the key stakeholders and what it takes to do this, and that's a huge undertaking. But at the end of the day, and this is also sort of a point that was raised by other activists, and that is the importance of political will on the part of governments, because they are at the helm and because they are the ones to put forward laws and policies to address that. So the hope is that there will be enough pressure from the bottom up to get action from the top down. And see all the different stakeholders work together to address this form of gender-based violence. Sukaina Al-Nasrawi, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. This was quite illuminating, and we look forward to continuing this discussion on this very important topic.
Thank you so much, Merissa. Thanks for Wilson Center, and hopefully together we achieve gender equality by combating violence against women and girls.